Hi again, guys. We are up to our third lesson in Sociology, Area of Study 1, Australian Indigenous Culture. So, this presentation, we're going to cover the sociological imagination, ethnocentrism, and cultural relativism. Now, there's some big words right now on your screen and in your brains, and this lesson is pretty theory heavy. We're going to take a step back from Indigenous culture and looking at specific examples, and we're going to get kind of theoretical. Please stick with it. Watch this video a couple of times if you need to. Take a break, come back to it. Perhaps start with literally just rote learning the definitions if that works for you. But don't let it put you off because these are really central concepts. And, we do discuss them fairly broadly at a VCE level. Okay, so we're going to stick with it. All right, so today, if you actually look at what I'm asking you to do, we can distill it down to 4 things. I want you to be able to explain the sociological imagination. Now, hopefully you've done this last year in Unit 1 and 2, so this won't be completely new to you. 2 new terms probably will be ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. They sound a lot scarier than they are, I promise. So I want you to be able to define each of those, and then I want you to be able to identify them. All that means is I want you to be able to say what they are and give me an example. Okay? Let's jump into it with the sociological imagination. So, we had our sociology big daddy, C. Wright Mills, back in the 50s, came up with this phrase, the sociological imagination. And it sounds really floaty, but it's really core to this discipline of sociology. So the sociological imagination is a way of thinking sociologically. And if we're using the sociological imagination, we're seeing the interconnections within society. So we're seeing individuals as part of broader systems and structures. So all that means is, people don't exist within a vacuum. People don't exist and just make choices without other things influencing their choices. They're part of society. There's lots of connections to different things in their world that affect how they behave. 2 important terms to kind of be aware of in the sociological imagination are personal troubles and public issues. And Wright Mills talked about these a lot when he initially was kind of thinking and writing about this. So, I haven't finished the sentence there in that first point, so ignore that. Basically, if we weren't using the sociological imagination, so if we were only seeing an issue at the individual level, so that means seeing an issue as a personal trouble, we're assuming that whatever is occurring is due to the person, their individual choices, psychology, or situation. I'll give you an example of this in a moment. So that's not using the sociological imagination, is seeing things as personal troubles. If we flick on our sociological imagination and we see many people having the same experience, not just individuals, but patterns of larger groups of people having the same experience, then we can see it as a public issue. And that shift is where we bring sociology into it. So to a sociologist, like I've written here, this is not coincidental and is the result of various structures within a society. Okay, this might all seem a bit abstract, so let's link it to an example. I mean, if we want to, sum it up in a quote, it's not you, it's the world around you. This isn't necessarily about excusing behaviour, but it is about explaining behaviour that occurs within social contexts. Okay. We're going to look at obesity. So, we've just said that the sociological imagination kind of prompts us to look at issues not as things that are just happening to individuals because of individual choices and individual motivations or circumstances or whatever, but actually as public issues, as things that many people may be experiencing as part of some structures in society. So we've got this guy on the right here who I think we can safely say is obese. All right. If we were considering his obesity, I'm going to flick to the next slide, just as a personal trouble, we might look at him and say things like, well, he's obese because he eats too much. It's a personal choice. He makes bad choices with food. He eats too much Maccas. He doesn't exercise enough and therefore he's obese. So flicking back to this, if we're not using the sociological imagination, we're seeing obesity as a personal trouble. We look at this guy and we think basically he's fat because he doesn't eat right, he eats too much fast food, he eats too much unhealthy food, he's not choosing the correct types of food, and he doesn't exercise enough. It's his problem and it's existing because of choices that he's made, end of story. But if we flick on our sociological imagination and we actually look at obesity as a public issue. So, sorry to flick back and forth so much, but our man here, he's not the only person in Australia with a big tummy, right? We can genuinely see obesity as a public issue because he is around 1/3 of Australians who are obese. So as sociologists, we have to say that's a structural issue. That is not a coincidence. There must be some structures within society that are causing obesity to be a problem, not just in one person, but in thousands and hundreds of thousands of people across the country or the world. So if we want to understand that guy's obesity, we're going to look not necessarily just at what he eats or how he exercises, but we're going to look at the structures around him. So we might look at ideas like, and I've got these here, the fact that obesity is more common in poorer communities. The fact that energy-dense food is available at low cost. And by that I mean it's cheaper to buy things that are fatty, that are loaded with carbs or calories or sugar than it is to buy, wholesome fruits and vegetables and grains and things like that. We can look at history. We can look at the fact that in 2020, our work is not out in the fields. It's not labouring. It's not doing domestic work. It's not working, excessively in our house and garden. It's not washing dishes and clothes and things like that by hand. Everything is more mechanised and it's sedentary. We go to work, we sit in an office. We drive home, we sit in our car. Those are structures of our society that may contribute to the public issue of obesity. We can look at the fact that car travel is increasingly popular. Fewer people are walking or taking exercise. This list isn't, the be all and end all, but there are plenty more ideas like that. We want to look not just at the personal, not just seeing this guy's obesity as a personal thing. We want to look at all of the different things that are existing around him. Let's look at another example. I'll try and do this a little bit more quickly. So, we've done obesity. We can even look at a smaller, maybe kind of less consequential issue. Let's look at what do we do after we finish school. So you guys are facing this year. If we saw it just as a personal issue, we'd say, well, yeah, I do what I want. I choose what I want to do. It's my choice. Someone else chooses what they want to do, and that's kind of the end of the story. But we switch on the sociological imagination. We can see this as a public issue. And we then might start to ask questions like, well, does my family have expectations about what I should do after school? Might there be cultural or religious factors at play here? Are there financial barriers to me choosing particular pathways? Is it just not an option for me to go to Melbourne Uni because the rent in the city is too expensive? Are there options that are less attractive or achievable for me because of my gender or background? Am I less likely to go into a field like science or technology or mathematics because I'm female, for example? How is the education system preparing me for certain pathways? What option does the system see as legitimate. So it's not just an option of off you go, you do whatever you want. You're in a system, and I'm part of that system, who is kind of directing you in a particular way. By doing VCE, where we're directing you towards a university degree, which is a very narrow subset of all of the things that you could potentially do with your life. There might even be pressures or expectations from friends. So, by asking all of these questions, you're using the sociological imagination. You're saying, I am not just me, I live within a society, within a culture, and there are structures around me that are going to influence what I do. Okay, looking at it a little bit of a different way, there's also this idea of a framework to look at the sociological imagination. I'll let you have a read of this yourself, but all those questions that we asked before, you could break those down into historical, cultural, structural, and critical factors. I'll let you have a look at that yourself. Okay, we'll have a look in class at the idea of marriage, and we'll use our sociological imaginations there. Okay, quick breather, pause if you need to. We're now going to move on to ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. Okay. So, first one, ethnocentrism. We do need to know this definition. Ethnocentrism is the practice of viewing and measuring another culture in relation to your own. Okay. So that means that when we think ethnocentrically, or when we adopt an ethnocentric view, we might view another culture as inferior, as illogical, or as less natural, just because it's different to our own. If we act ethnocentrically, so if you view things in relation to our culture, it can often lead to the creation of stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, and racism, because there's this them and us dynamic. So basically, if I told you right now about another culture in a different country where it's common practice to eat bugs, for example, as a source of protein, then if you adopted an ethnocentric view, you would say, oh my gosh, in our culture, we do not eat bugs. We do not go anywhere near insects. We don't do anything like that. We only eat very specific types of animals. They're socially accepted, and insects are pests, and they're for killing and for getting rid of. So what we're doing there is, even if we're not explicitly saying it, we're saying, well, that culture that as part of their culture eats insects, they're kind of a bit backwards, aren't they? They haven't got it quite right. There's something weird going on there. They're unnatural. They're, a little bit illogical. Basically, they are inferior to us. We don't understand them. We don't accept them. And that's how, if we adopt this ethnocentric view, can lead to a lot of negative things like prejudice and discrimination. The flip side of that is cultural relativism. So if ethnocentrism is looking at cultures from our own standards, cultural relativism is looking at a culture according to their standards. And actually, key to it is attempting to understand. So cultural relativism involves analysing a culture from the point of view of its members. If we go back to the insect example, we might, rather than immediately dismissing it, we might say, I wonder why they do that. Perhaps we could ask them some questions about that. Is it because they have a proliferation of, insects that are really high protein? Is it because it's a really cheap way of getting food? Is it because it's an easy way of feeding themselves and they can then focus on other things like protecting themselves from harm? Is it because insects are actually delicious and we're all missing out? It's believed that by adopting this cultural relativistic view, we're going to have a better understanding and we're not going to judge other cultures. So when we think in a culturally relative way, we don't expect that everyone's going to be the same. We expect difference when we look at other cultures. We look at that difference, and rather than react against it and say, oh, that's not like me, we ask questions, we don't judge, we try and find out a little bit more. A lot of people have criticised cultural relativism, and there's a particular criticism or a misunderstanding of it that it's too loose. And as I've written here, that it allows for any cultural practice to be accepted without judgment. And this is thought to be irresponsible on the grounds that we might turn a blind eye to questionable cultural practices, such as female genital mutilation, which you can look at more yourself if you'd like to. So it's this idea that, you know, a group or a society might say, oh, in our culture, we practice cannibalism. The idea that if you were culturally relativistic, then, you know, you would kind of just accept that and not judge it and not question the idea that, you know, that might be a little bit of a problem. So the kind of counter criticism to that, or what the people who are culturally relativistic would say, they would say, no, cultural relativism is based on a human rights model. So yes, we try and understand and accept without judgment, but we also adhere to basic human rights principles. So cultural relativism can highlight the practices and experiences by drawing attention to them without imposing a value judgment. Okay. This Khan Academy video is really useful. I've included it here in the slides. If you go to the links in the actual slide on Google Classroom, then you can follow it there, or you can search for it on YouTube. And in class, we'll also look at the example of climbing Uluru to bring it back to Australian Indigenous culture. Okay, that was a lot. Thank you for sticking with me. This might be one that you need to revisit a couple of times, and that's totally fine. We'll keep coming back to these concepts in class. It's almost certain that they will be on the exam in some form, so I encourage you to, you know, put in some effort to try and get your head around them. If we go back to what we wanted to do, we wanted to explain the basic idea of the sociological imagination, which we did. We said it was thinking of ourselves and other people as part, you know, as one part of a society in which various structures influence them. Ethnocentrism, we said, was evaluating other cultures in relation to your own, whereas cultural relativism was trying to evaluate cultures from the point of view of their members. And we wanted to look at some examples, which we'll do a little bit more in class. Okay, thank you very much. Go and take a brain break, and I'll see you next lesson. See ya.